The Telepathy Tapes podcast has gone absolutely viral online by making bold claims that challenge everything that we know about the brain and mind. Millions of people have now watched these videos of nonverbal children apparently communicating telepathically with their primary caregivers.
Let's please multiply two numbers and see if he gets it.
Okay, what is it?
9, 0, 0.
Unbelievable.
My guest today, Dr. Jeffrey Tarrant, was actually there in the room when these experiments were being done, and he used his expertise to gather brainwave data of the test subjects for the research team. So I'm really excited to sit down with Dr. Tarrant today and ask him point blank, is this phenomena real? What is the data showing? And what could this mean for the study of the brain and the mind moving forward?
Hey everybody, welcome to the show. I've got Dr. Jeff Tarrant here, who's actually been on Tech for Psych a couple of times before, and we're really excited to have him back. Jeff, thanks for coming on.
Hey, I appreciate you inviting me back.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of your bio. You're a clinical neuropsychologist, the founder of Neuromeditation Institute, and you've been focusing on gathering brainwave data in different phenomena like meditation, but even things like mediumship and psychic abilities. And I just love your approach to these topics that are so fringe, but your mentality's always been, let's collect the data and see what's going on here. And I've got your books here that I've really enjoyed because it takes a scientific and analytical approach to these phenomena and attempts to answer a lot of attempts to address a lot of questions. So I very much appreciate your work.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, a little story. I was watching, I was on Instagram or TikTok and just scrolling through, and this interesting video came up, and I had heard a little bit about telepathy tapes, but I was like, oh, okay, this is this thing that they were talking about that's trending a little bit. Let's see what's going on here. So I'm watching, and they're illustrating these nonverbal children that apparently have these psychic connections with their caretakers, able to sort of see through their eyes and what they're seeing through their mental abilities. And I hear this voice come up, and I'm like, is that who I think it is? And then I see you on screen. I'm like, it's Jeff. He's in telepathy tapes. That's awesome. I'm going to be able to ask him about this stuff. So I'd love to jump right into that. What was it like working on telepathy tapes?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really amazing and really, pretty life-changing for me personally. I mean, so it's been interesting from a scientific perspective and just witnessing some of, just the most amazing things I've probably ever seen. And so, but then of course, you almost can't see something like that and then have it not change your life. So it's been personally really rewarding as well, and I mean, and honestly, the crew behind the telepathy tapes, Kai and everybody she's pulled together, just really astounding. And, I've been really impressed with their integrity through the whole process of really trying to stick with the story, stick with, talking about the experiences of these spellers and really focusing on that, which I think is really the most important part.
Yeah, the way that she set up the experiments just kind of made you feel like they were trying to exclude as much doubt as possible that these children were able to do what they were doing. I read this critic, because I was looking like, okay, what's the negative feedback here? Like, what are the critics saying about, how this could be faked? And this person in this blog was, they mentioned you personally, he's got this neuropsychologist named Jeff Tarrant. I'm like, hi, I know Jeff, I can ask him about this. But he was saying that the parents could do nonverbal cues, like they're holding the number cards and the letter cards, and they make these little micro movements, and that allows the children to pick the right number on the card. I'm like, how the heck could that be possible? They're just picking out three digits of accuracy, one after the other.
Yeah, I mean, I've got mixed feelings about, some of the criticisms, because, I think some of the criticisms are valid from a research perspective. You want to control every possible element that could be influencing their responses that aren't telepathy. And so having the mom hold the letterboard, who is also the person who saw the cue, that's not ideal. And certainly it's theoretically, it's possible that they could be making little movements that are somehow cueing the non-speaker to where they're going. But you're right. I mean, it would be really challenging because if you think about it, if there's a letter board with 26 letters on it, is that how many letters are in the alphabet? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
And they're spelling a word. Even if there's a slight little shift in the letter board, there's still a whole bunch of letters that are right in front of your face, right? And so how do you know to go exactly to the right one, right? So I get the argument, witnessing it, you do sometimes see that there's slight movements. And I think what's happening is that the caregiver is trying to facilitate their ability to communicate. And, a lot of these kids have a lot of difficulty with motor skills. And so, trying to make it as easy for them as possible makes sense. From a research perspective, it's not ideal.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, some of the things that some of the critics don't necessarily talk about as much, is there were instances like Akil, who I think was focused on in episode 2, I think. And he types independently on a keyboard. And so there's footage of him and there's experiments with him where he's on the totally opposite other end of the room with his own keyboard, typing it in himself.
Let's please multiply 2 numbers and see if he gets it.
Okay, what is it?
9 0 0.
Unbelievable.
And it's kind of like, okay, so nobody's holding a letter board, and even some of the experiments that I was involved in, we had set up a 2-computer synchronized test scenario where the sender, the mom usually, receives some sort of a cue, whether it's random numbers or a word or something. And then the receiver, the non-speaker, has to input their response. And of course, they're on opposite ends of a table. There's no way they can see each other's computers. And when we did that test, actually, because, the mom is on the opposite side, so she's not holding the letter board. But when we did that, the non-speaker we were working with is not particularly adept at using a keyboard. So we had somebody else hold the letter board that didn't know any of the numbers, any of the letters. They weren't seeing the cue. And so that way, this was Houston. So Houston could respond on the letter board, and then it was typed in by the person helping, but neither of them had seen any of the cues. They couldn't see the other computer. So, we do have some tests where at least that element was really controlled for. And so, it doesn't get as much attention, but, we've seen that data. We need more of that kind of data. But it does exist.
How did they originally reach out to you to do these quantitative EEG brain scans on the children?
Yeah, so, Dr. Powell, who was the one that really kind of started getting a lot of attention for this kind of work, and we had known each other for a long time because of some of our similar interests, and she actually just lives like 3 hours down the road. And she had reached out to me and said, hey, we're going to be doing some more testing. Would you want to, collect some brain imaging data? And I was like, yeah, that sounds, it's right up my alley. That's the kind of stuff I'm interested in. And of course, you're not going to turn that down. And it was at about the same time that Kai got involved. And so, Kai reached out to me and wanted to, check me out. And, before we started filming for the documentary. And, we got along great. And so then I just kind of became part of the initial team that, because initially it wasn't designed to be a podcast. It was designed to be a documentary. And so, all of us were going to the homes of these individuals. And, there was a whole film crew and, it was semi-chaotic. But we were trying to get good film data. That was the primary issue, to create a sizzle reel, to go pitch. But nonetheless, we were still trying to create as much control as possible over the testing because everybody was aware from the beginning, right? That it's like, okay, when people see this, they're not going to believe it. So like, we got to make sure that there's no reflective surfaces in the room, and that, as much as possible, we're keeping everybody separate from each other, and that nobody knows what the prompts are, and, all of these kinds of things. So really my involvement was really at the beginning with, so I was able to test 3 of the individuals. And obviously on the telepathy tapes, there's a whole lot more that, Kai interviewed and has been involved with. But my involvement has really at this point been with 3 families.
So let's just put the audience in the room. You show up, you've got your EEG equipment. And was there a moment where you're like, oh my gosh, like, how is this happening?
Yeah, but, because of the way it was set up, the first day, and honestly, I really kind of didn't know what I was getting myself into, fully. And so the first day of testing, like I said, there's all these cameras around, and they're trying to figure out how to get the right kind of shots, and trying to put the family at ease, especially the very first day that we did this was with Mia and her family that live in Mexico. And so most of the family doesn't even speak English. And so, they had flown up from Mexico to, Burbank, where we were doing all this. And so trying to make sure everybody's comfortable and doing some preliminary tests just to sort of get a sense of what's going on. So honestly, I didn't get a chance to do the EEG stuff until like way later in the day. So I was just observing for the first 5 hours of the day, which was actually kind of cool because I could just stand back and sort of see what was happening. And for the initial testing, I was actually outside. They set up a monitor, outside. They were trying to get everybody out of the house where we were filming, just to, create less distraction and whatever. And yeah, when I saw Mia do her thing for the first time, I mean, honest to God, I think my jaw about hit the floor because, it was just crazy. I think they started with like a random 3-digit number, and, just no problem. She just boom, 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 and just one after another.
Yeah,
that's kind of like,
that's what I was going to say is like, if it happened once, that's like, okay, maybe that could have happened. But like, if you're standing there all day and just watching her do it again and again and again, like, does that kind of just put your mind in a different place, you think, than other people that have kind of watched just the podcast or the documentary that haven't seen it firsthand?
For sure. And again, some of the skeptics or critics, they haven't seen it. And so I get it, and you just see a tiny little clip, and maybe there's something in the clip that looks like, oh, I don't know, something might be going on there. But when you're in the room and you see this happening all day long, under lots of different circumstances and lots of different tests, and they pretty much don't miss, which is the crazy part, right? Because, most of the telepathy research that's been done prior to this point is, with neurotypical individuals, and it's a forced choice kind of a setup where the sender sees an image or something, and then the receiver has 4 choices of images, and it's like, well, which one do you think it was, right? So you've got a 25% chance of guessing right, and in that research, it's like it generally comes out at like 30% or something, which is statistically significant, and it's interesting. So it's like, okay, people can do better than chance. But then when you're seeing people do this in an open response format, it's not forced choice. It's like, what's the word? What word am I looking at? And it's like, holy crap. Yeah. And like when I was doing the testing on the computer, like one of the words was manager. So we were doing like 3-syllable words. And, Houston was just boop, 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 just spell it out, no problem. Doing full sentences out of a book, that his mom was looking at. And so like open response like that, like just not missing anything, that's a whole different deal, right? Because it's like, clearly they're just completely tapped in.
Yeah, we were recently on another call with Russell Targ, the physicist, who's done a lot of work with remote viewing, even, involved in a little bit with the CIA and other things. And the way that I see that and he's a big proponent of remote viewing, but also that's like kind of open for interpretation. It's like you're drawing a picture of some remote site and, you know, it's kind of close and it's close enough. But with this is just so accurate that it's just, I think that's why the podcast is having such a big impact. It's like, wow, if this is true and it's with this special neurodivergent population that might have something unique about their brains, like what does that mean about what our brains are capable of? What does that mean about the physics of the universe? There's so many implications.
For sure. Yeah. And I mean, I think everybody has been surprised at the amount of attention that this has got, but I take that as a good sign, right? That like people are really hungry for this kind of understanding, right? That maybe there is something bigger, that we're not just physical body meat sacks walking around, that there's more to it. And, you know, and then to see these, you know, spellers who are so ridiculously accurate. And then, you know, they apparently have some other abilities as well. Many of them do. So it starts to raise all kinds of interesting questions.
Yeah. And going back to what I appreciate about so much about your work is like you're getting data, so we can actually like talk about the data, not just, you know, theorize what's going on with the brain and, you know, metaphysics or physics, whatever you want to call it. So what exactly did you see on the brain scans? I know you've done a lot of work with people with mediumship abilities and, you know, claim other psychic phenomena, but what specifically did you see in the nonverbal children that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, there's a few things that were interesting. And first I should just say that, you know, getting good EEG data with this population is not the easiest thing in the world. And we definitely had some struggles at various points because, you know, for those that aren't familiar, you know, EEG collection is very sensitive to any kind of movement, vocalizations, anything like that. It's going to create what we call artifact in the signal, which is basically noise. And it makes it hard to sort of get a clean picture. And so, you know, of course, a lot of these, you know, non-speakers have difficulty modulating their body, their physical body. Some of them will vocalize randomly. And so, you know, it was hard to get some really clean data. We got enough data that I think we were able to find some interesting things. And the way that we analyzed it was essentially by getting a baseline first of their EEG when they weren't engaged in telepathy. And typically I would get that baseline data while they were spelling, because that's how they're going to be responding during the telepathy experiments. So we would just have them responding to random questions or whatever. So got their brainwave data while they're spelling, and then collect data while they're spelling, but during a telepathy exercise, so that we can say, well, it wasn't just because they were spelling something, right? That's not why we saw brain changes. And then essentially like subtracting them from each other. So then we can say, well, what's the difference? And that seems to work pretty well, because if you have some noise in let's say the baseline recording from a little bit of extra movement or things like that, well, you're probably going to have similar noise in the second recording. And then when they're subtracted from each other, you kind of lose most of that. So what was interesting is that from the three people that I was able to test, so I tested Mia, Houston, and John Paul, and none of their brains did exactly the same thing. And at this point in my work, I'm not surprised by that, because we've seen that with mediums and psychics as well, that even though there's some interesting patterns, it's not like everybody does the exact same thing, which I think is actually important, even when thinking of this specific population, that, well, they're still individuals and their brains are all going to be different from each other. And so why would their brains change in the exact same way when they're engaged in telepathy? But like Houston, for example, he probably had the cleanest data, because he just is really great at being able to sit still and, you know, modulate his body, you know, really effectively. And so when he was doing the telepathy exercises, what we saw was, you know, a decrease of fast brain waves in the frontal lobe. So kind of not a big surprise there. That kind of makes some sense. And it was particularly leaning over to the right frontal lobe, which again is pretty consistent with some things I've seen with other psychic abilities, and not even just with, folks who have an autism diagnosis, right? Is this sort of change of activity in the right frontal lobe. So he showed that. He also showed an increase of his brain pattern was really interesting.
Is he right-handed?
Yes.
I was thinking, okay, because like left is, left brain for right-handed people is more analytical, right? And I think the right side is more present moment, big idea, and apparently extrasensory perception.
Yeah, and we see a lot of this right and left brain differentiation with other things as well. With psychics and mediums, it shows up a lot. With Houston, it was like almost like drawing a line down the middle of the brain and seeing this different response, because he actually showed an increase of theta activity only in the right hemisphere. There was no, the left side just looked completely the same as it did before. But the right side, all of a sudden, there's this giant burst of, actually, it was 7 and 8 hertz, very specifically. Which is interesting too, because that's kind of right there in that Schumann resonance frequency. So that was in the right hemisphere.
What's that, Jeff? I'm not that familiar with that.
Yeah, so the Schumann resonance it's the energy, the electromagnetic field that exists between the ionosphere and the Earth. And it's created predominantly by lightning strikes on the planet. And so it creates this electromagnetic field that we all live in, right? Because it's what's around us on planet Earth. And the dominant frequency is 7.83 hertz. And, it was discovered by some guy named Schumann, right? So it's the Schumann resonance or the Schumann frequency. And
sounds kind of like Lynn McTaggart, like the field kind of concept, right? There's some kind of energy that's connecting empty space. And it's like, can the human mind tap into that and communicate across distances?
That's an interesting idea, and we do see theta activity show up, not all the time, but it does seem to show up in various psi phenomena. And, Schumann falls right there in that upper part of the theta frequency band. So it may be connected, maybe not, I don't know. But it's interesting.
Seems like some of the holosync tapes, right? The binaural beats through gateway experience, that type of work talks about those types of frequencies as well, or at least tries to elicit them through the audio recordings.
For sure. Yeah, and we use it with the audio visual entrainment as well. In fact, it's dialed in specifically, right? 7.83, very specific.
What? Well, I think that's incredibly interesting, right? Because so you get these nonverbal children, so you can posit all these possibilities of do our verbal linguistic abilities actually get in the way of being able to, tap into these phenomena? I'd love to ask you about that. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's certainly one of the theories that we're kind of playing with right now, right? Is that, maybe one of the reasons that they are so talented is because they don't have the limitations imposed by language. In fact, listening to the telepathy tapes and what some of the non-speakers talk about is that, telepathy is just way more efficient. It's a lot of work for them to have to communicate using words. And, many of them can get themselves to do it, but it's a lot of work. Telepathy is just way simpler, right, for them. And to me, it makes sense that, the idea that when we're using language, really what we're doing is we are taking information from the environment and putting some sort of label on it, right? We're trying to sort of make everything concrete and easy to understand and in some sort of structured way. And, when we do that, of course, we've actually changed the nature of what the experience was. As soon as we put words on something, we've actually changed it. And so it's no longer the pure essence of what it was. And so for me, it makes me wonder if maybe because they live most of the time in this other space where they're not engaged with language the way we think of it, that, they're just more tapped into the purity of what exists out there. They're not as limited, and I think that makes a lot of sense because, a lot of the brain is oriented toward inhibiting things.
Right. Filter out the massive amount of data that's coming in so we can make sense of this crazy world.
Exactly. Right. All the brain cares about is like, well, what do I need to pay attention to survive? Right. Like what is immediately relevant to my physical existence. And so, yeah, it filters out everything else. And, so for many of these folks, if those barriers aren't there, they don't have that inhibition, which also makes sense of why sometimes they appear to be so sensitive to the environment, right? If you can't filter out everything, then it's going to be overwhelming to have all of the lights and sounds and noises and thoughts, and many of these kids talk about that, if they're around too many people, it's like there's too much internal noise because they're picking up the information from everybody else in the room. And, so it's just a noise factory. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, there's so many rabbit holes to go down there. I'm thinking of other types of neurology that we see out there, like schizophrenia, I think is an example where it seems like some of these filtering mechanisms are cross-wired or not there, that causes people to have a lot of difficulty, functioning from day to day. Let's go back to, the findings, the cold hard data. So we were talking about increased data in the right hemisphere of one of the individuals that you looked at. Any other findings that were interesting?
Yeah. So, Mia, so it was interesting because her brain, so she did show an increase of theta activity, but it was frontal. So it was kind of across the whole frontal lobe. It wasn't specific to the right hemisphere, which again makes some sense, kind of disinhibiting the frontal lobe. But instead of showing a decrease of activity in the right frontal lobe like Houston did, she actually showed an increase of activity in the right frontal lobe. And again, so I've seen this a lot with psychics and mediums where the regions of the brain show up consistently. Right frontal lobe is one of them that show up as something is changing there. But what's interesting is that not everybody changes it the same way. Some people increase energy there. Some people decrease energy there. For some people, it's all of the brain waves. For other people, it's very specific brain waves. But that right frontal lobe shows up over and over again.
Yeah, in this book, you talked about how sort of the way that they're experiencing the phenomena, whether they're like seeing things or hearing things, that corresponded to specific brain activity. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know if I talked about that too much in the book in terms of whether they're seeing or hearing information, because actually that's
what I remember is that, one of the mediums reported, kind of seeing the information that was coming to them. So you got more activity in the occipital lobe versus like hearing things. There's more activity in the temporal lobe, for example. So it's like kind of corresponding brain activity to the uniqueness of the experience, which was different from individual to individual.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because I haven't, this question has come up before, and it's actually one of the questions I've not really analyzed fully. It makes sense that people would have more activation in auditory centers if they're hearing things or whatever. Honestly, I don't have enough clear data to separate that, because a lot of the psychics and mediums that I've worked with, they get information all different ways. They hear it, they see it, they feel it. And so it's like, well, how do you separate that, right? Because if it's all kind of happening together, it makes it really difficult. So what I need is a bunch of participants that they really are only using one primary player, sense. But it is true that, one of the things I talked about, like in relation to the frontal lobe, is that, perhaps for certain people, they need to shift their baseline brainwave activity to be more focused, right? Like it's like, like kind of almost like reaching out there to get the information. Like I need to like zone in, cut out all of this noise and zone in to get this word or this image. So maybe that's what Mia is doing, why there's this increased activation. Whereas for other people, maybe it's the opposite, that it's like, oh, I actually need to like step back and let my mind be more open and receptive. Gotcha. And so, why is it like that? I don't know. But it's interesting that, again, you see these patterns. The other thing that was interesting with Mia was one of the experiments that we did wasn't actually, technically, it wasn't telepathy. And it involved these colored popsicle sticks. And this was a game her and her mom had made up, much earlier. And in fact, I witnessed them kind of playing this game, because again, we've got all these cameras everywhere. And so it would take all this time to like set up a shot and move things around and change things and test the audio. So, Mia's just like hanging out, like waiting for us. So her and her mom are kind of sitting there killing time, and they'd be playing these little psychic games, just kind of off by themselves on the side. And then we tested them more officially to see what was going on. But so what her mom did was she took a bunch of popsicle sticks and colored them. I think they had 6 colors. So some were green, some were blue, red, whatever. And she had a big bag of them. And so she would take one of each color and lay it out on the table in front of Mia and put a blindfold on her. So we're using a mindfold, which, has some extra foam around the edges so that there's like really no light that comes in at all. It's pitch black. So put this on Mia and then would randomly shuffle through the bag, pull out a popsicle stick, and Mia would take the popsicle stick, she can't see, and lay it in the correct pile. Right? So give her a red one, she sticks it in the red pile. Give her a green one, she sticks it in the green pile. And, just over and over again. And it's like, okay, like this is something different, right? Because this isn't telepathy exactly. How the heck is she able to take this popsicle stick? She can't see. She's got a blindfold on and she's putting them in the right piles. Right?
Is there any conjecture on like what she's actually experiencing in her perception to get that information? Is it like she's seen through her mother's eyes, or is it like a concept that she's acting on? What were the conversations in the room and around the science?
Yeah, unfortunately we didn't get a ton of that. It's interesting because they did ask her at one point, are you seeing through your mother's eyes? And my recollection is that the answer was no, which is interesting because a lot of the other participants in the telepathy tapes work have described it that way, that they're seeing through the other person's eyes. So I don't know if it was a communication issue that maybe it didn't come across, the question didn't come across clearly, or if maybe people are using different abilities, that in some cases they're seeing through their mother's eyes, and in other cases they're using some other kind of ability. I don't know. I mean,
that's the problem with this. That's the problem with this work on the ground. You get your elbows in the mud, and there's so many factors that come into these things. It's like, how do you tease them apart scientifically? Is just so challenging.
Yes, it is. Well, and some of what Mia was doing reminds me of, that work with, what do they call it? Mind Sight. Is that what it's called? The program where they teach people to see without using their eyes. If you've seen that program, Carolyn Corey's movie Superhuman does a good job of kind of following some of this. And it's kind of similar. These people are blindfolded and they've got kids like running obstacle courses and they're blindfolded, right?
Interesting. I haven't seen that one.
And so, so maybe there's another ability that allows people to see without using their eyes. And so, is it a similar mechanism? I don't know. But where I was going with that was Mia's brainwave pattern actually looked pretty different when she was doing that activity versus the telepathy, which also makes me think it's something a little bit different.
Seems like some kind of balancing act for the brain. If you imagine this field that it needs to tap into, it's like, do you need to rev up a little bit? You need to rev down. And maybe that's based on each person's unique brain architecture, they need a little something different to nudge them in the right direction to do these things. I mean, that's what I'm thinking about as I'm hearing you talk.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes it a little bit tricky to think about extending this to the rest of the world, right? The thing that's encouraging to me is that we've identified certain brain regions that show up over and over again. We talked about the right frontal lobe. The right parietal lobe shows up over and over. And in fact, that showed up for Mia with the popsicle stick experiment. That right parietal lobe kind of went offline. There was a big increase of delta and theta back there. So, we do see certain brain regions and certain patterns that show up semi-consistently. And so I think the trick is, extending these findings. How can we help people nudge those parts of the brain in different ways? And maybe everybody has to experiment a little bit. Well, what happens if I rev it up? What happens if I quiet it down? And figure out what they need in order to maybe access those states for themselves.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. And I'll put a plug in for, your Neuromeditation Institute and all the great work you're doing there. Now that the dust has settled a little bit, although not that much, it seems like there's still a lot of momentum right now. As you're sitting back and thinking about what you saw with telepathy tapes and the data that you saw and the attention that it's gotten, how does that shape, your view of like your career and what you're doing with the Neuromeditation Institute and what's next?
Yeah. And, of course, I want to keep collecting data on some of these, spellers and their abilities. And, we're working on improving some of the testing methodologies to make it even more airtight, to address some of the things that the critics have brought up. So, of course, I'm working on all of that. But then, this other element of, is there a way to reverse engineer some of this? And not just with, these telepathic, non-speakers, but really what I'm interested in at the moment is like, what is the overlap with what we're seeing with them and then what we see with other psychics and mediums that are neurotypical?
Yeah.
And there is a fair amount of overlap, which is kind of interesting. And so, I feel like we're getting closer and closer. I mean, we've already been doing some experimentation with things like audiovisual entrainment and, low power transcranial magnetic stimulation and things like that, which actually seem to have been pretty effective, at least in certain circumstances. So I feel like we're getting closer to figuring out how to help people nudge their brain into a more receptive state.
Yeah, there's no telling where this is going to go. And there's a lot of reports and even whistleblowers coming out of the government and private contractors apparently right now saying that the government has reverse engineering programs of UAPs and that they're calling these things in through special people with special abilities called psionics. They can call in the UFOs with their mind power.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know anything about this. This is just what I see is being reported on, programs like News Nation, but it's kind of very related, I think. And maybe that's why people are getting so interested in the telepathy tapes and, these whistleblowers that are coming out and saying these things. Like, as you said before, is there a lot that we've been missing, certain things that have been sort of cast aside as pseudoscience in the past? And maybe we need to take another look. Maybe, people that were in the know to actually utilize these technologies weren't exactly forthcoming in the government. And, maybe the scientific community needs to take another look.
For sure. Yeah. And really, that's a big hope of mine is that, enough people find interest in all of this that's coming out. I mean, the telepathy tapes, but also like what you're describing, right? This interesting information that's coming out from whistleblowers about all these UAPs, that it's really going to put more attention and hopefully more serious attention, because as you pointed out, these are things that have all been, sort of brushed aside and thought of as pseudoscience or worse. And so having more and more legitimate people stepping forward and going like, no, this is happening and we need to study this. And my sense is that more and more people are getting on board with that. And that, to me, that's really exciting. I mean, again, I've seen enough for myself that I'm convinced that at least some of this is real. And so how do we understand this, and what does this mean, right? Because, and again, I have no idea about UAPs, but if there's people because essentially what we're talking about is telepathy.
Right.
If these psionics are doing what they say they're doing, well, they're telepathically communicating with whatever these things are. So again, there it is again. And so, yeah, it raises other interesting, issues like, well, what are these psionics doing, and how do we tap into that? For folks who are interested in expanding their consciousness for whatever purpose, whether it's, to contact UAPs or, for spiritual purposes or for, telepathic experiences.
Yeah, maybe I missed this in the telepathy tapes, but were they able to demonstrate that the children could do this at a distance? Seems like most of the tests that they were doing were in the same room. Are they able to demonstrate that they could do it in different places, like different houses, for example?
Yeah, so many of them can and have demonstrated that. It seems like it varies a little bit from person to person. So some of them really do best with either their guardian, their parent, or, somebody, a support person, like right there with them. And, one of the discussion points of that is that having somebody there to help them modulate their physical body is necessary for a lot of these folks. And so, yeah, it makes it difficult to start doing some other types of things, but I've heard plenty of stories of where this is done at a distance and, or again, like bringing up a keel, like there's, a keel knows what his mom's been out doing. Like she's out running errands and he knows exactly where she's at and what she's doing. And, and then can tell her later, oh, you went to this store and you bought this and you did this. And so clearly some of them are able to tap in, at a distance.
But they can't just do it with anybody, right? Like, wasn't that same individual couldn't do it with his father? It was only with the mother?
Yeah, Mia, she can only do it with her mother. And so this is another interesting thing because like Houston can do it with just about anybody. Because, I witnessed him do it with somebody on the film crew, after we were done. The person on the film crew, I kind of felt bad for those folks, right? Because they're sitting there watching this all day and they got to kind of stay out of it. It's like, just do your job, just film.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, this one guy wrote a word on a piece of paper and held it to his chest and went up to Houston and said, what word do I have here? And Houston spelled it out, friend was the word, and just spelled it perfectly.
Wild.
And
wild.
So, there are some of them seem to be able to tap into a variety of people. And so I'm curious about that too. Like, why is it that some of them seem to only be able to connect with their moms or primary caregiver? It's usually the mom. And others, it doesn't seem to matter. It could be a sibling or a friend or anybody. So that's another thing I'm interested in kind of testing when we go out on this next round is, can they read me?
Yeah.
And partly that's just fun, right?
Right. So what are the next steps? We can close up with that. What are the next steps here? Are there different types of experiments to be done? Are there?
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the things that, I'm working right now on this sort of advanced computer testing system that would allow us to do some of the testing remotely for telepathy. And so I think this will be really exciting because it'll open up the possibility of being able to work with a lot more families, as opposed to like having to go to each individual person's house. And,
right.
I want to do that as well because I want to collect more EEG data because obviously we need to see how consistent this is, if there's, more that we can learn from that. So there's the telepathy piece, there's the EEG piece, But I'm also curious because so many of them seem to have other abilities. I'm interested in trying things like micro PK experiments with them and trying psychometry. Bring a bunch of objects, stick them in a paper bag, and it's like, what do you think this is? Or
and the micro PK, is that the random number generator influence? Like, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so most of the way, so micro PK, so psychokinesis, and so micro PK is affecting very small things. And so typically we use a random number generator that's kicking out ones and zeros in the background of a program. And, because it's just ones and zeros, you're going to end up with 50% ones and 50% zeros with enough repetition. And so, there's been lots of research showing that we can mentally influence that outcome. If you focus on ones, you can alter the outcome so it's no longer 50%. That, you can modulate that.
But this is like what you were talking about, right? Like usually those results are really small effect sizes.
They're super small.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're ridiculously small. They're statistically significant, but they're not super impressive when you look at the percentages, right?
Right.
So I'd be curious, right? Like, some of these kids are so good at like telepathy, right? Like just blowing the doors off of any other research we've ever seen.
Yeah.
Like, can they do micro PK? Could they, instead of getting 50.6%, could they get 90%, right?
That'd be wild. I would love to see that.
Yeah. And then, psychometry is the ability to pick up information from an object. And so, that's always, a fun thing to do, right? Like you've got a paper bag, so you don't know what's in it, but maybe it's a bracelet that belonged to my grandmother. Right.
Right.
But then for somebody to pick it up and go like, oh, you know what? I'm getting that this was, belonged to an older woman and it was given to her by, whatever, right? Like you come up with information. And so again, because there's reports that a lot of these individuals can do so many different things, I'd be curious, like what happens,
Yeah.
So I don't know how much of this I'll be able to test or not, but they're fun ideas.
Oh, I love them. And I'm looking forward to all the work that you're working on. And how can people get in touch with you if they want to work with you? And what can they look forward to with the Neuromeditation Institute?
Yeah. So we have a couple of websites. One is the neuromeditationinstitute.com, and that's focused more on combining neurofeedback with meditation strategies. And so there's a lot of information on there, and that's right up your alley. That's the work you do, and a lot of the work you do. And so people can learn about that by going to the website. The other website is psychicmindscience.com. And that's a little bit more of this world that we're in right now, talking about psi phenomena, what's going on in the brain. And again, there's a lot of info there. So those are the two easiest ways for people to check out what we're doing. And there's obviously ways to get in touch with me through both websites.
Awesome, Jeff. Well, I really appreciate your time, and thanks so much for sitting down and talking with me. This extremely interesting stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Cody. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thanks.